following bills. H.R. 1259, the dextromethorphan distribution. No, we were going to do the other ones. I just said you will do all of them and just do unanimous consent. Distribution Act by Representative Upton. H.R. 1246, the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Act, Representative Capps. H.R. 1253, the Health Insurance Restrictions and Limitations Clarification Act, Representative Burgess. H.R. 20, the Melanie Blocker Stokes Mom's Opportunity to Access Health Education, Research, and Support for Postpartum Depression, Representative Rush. H.R. 307, the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Act, Representative Baldwin. H.R. 479, the Wakefield Act, Representative Matheson. H.R. 577, the Vision Care for Kids Act, 2009, Representative Green. H.R. 756, the National Pain Care Policy Act of 2009, Representative Capps. H.R. 914, the Physician Workforce Enhancement Act of 2009, Representative Burgess. Without objection, all of these bills will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Hearing no objection, that will be the order. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to proceed on all of these bills, but before we do that, I want to recognize Mr. Barton for some comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say, as I said in my opening statement, we appreciate the bipartisanship of these consent bills, the 9 consent bills that are before us today. I have agreed with the motion that you just made that we consider them together so that we can move on to the tobacco bill, which will be a little bit more contentious. I do want to engage you in a, not necessarily a colloquy, but at least something of a dialogue about the bills that deal with the NIH. As you well know, in the stimulus package that the House and the Senate just passed and the President signed, there is $10 billion, that's B, $10 billion in additional funding for NIH. This includes $8.2 billion for research, $500 million for facilities, $1 billion to renovate a university biomedical and behavioral research facilities, and $300 million for instrumentation. This is a 34% increase in the baseline of the NIH budget. I have no idea how this amount of funding at one time is going to impact the NIH, and I would hope that you would agree with me that before the NIH begins to obligate these funds, we should call the NIH directors and the political appointees that have already been appointed to the NIH before this committee to do an oversight hearing and get some input on behalf of the committee about how they intend to use this amount of funding. I'm told at the staff level you agree with this approach, and I would just like to get your comments on the record on this.
Gentlemen, you would yield. I support your concerns that we require NIH to explain how they plan to use the funds appropriated to them in the stimulus package, and I think it would be appropriate for us to have an oversight hearing on this very subject. So I look forward to working with you.
I appreciate the chairman's input and take you at your word. We will work with you to schedule that hearing at a time that's convenient for NIH and also convenient for the committee. And I appreciate your interest in this. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I evidently have taken everybody off guard by asking all these other bills to be brought up. And there are some manager amendments to some of them, which have been shared and for which there's no controversy. So if there's no objection, I'd like to ask, when we ask that all the bills be considered as read, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that they be considered in block. Without objection, that'll be the order. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the manager's amendment to H.R. 479 be considered as read and adopted. Without objection, that'll be the order. To H.R. 577, there's a chairman has a manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, that'll be considered as read, and without objection, the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. On H.R. 20, there is an amendment by the chairman. Without objection, it will be considered as read and adopted. Without hearing any objection, that will be the order. Now I would like to ask unanimous consent that the in-block consideration of all these bills be put to a vote. Yes.
Art has asked, he really wanted to speak in his bill. He's running that right now. Give him time.
Okay. These are all very good bills. We used to have a chairman of one of the appropriations subcommittees who used to stand up on the floor to present his subcommittee appropriations bill. He'd stand up and always open his comments by saying, "This is a very good bill, if I don't say so myself." And I think that was the only thing you were able to understand, because the rest of the time he mumbled.
That was Mr. Whitten, and it was...
Reserving the right to object.
Yes. I recognize the gentleman on his reservation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had prepared amendments on the issue I alluded to in my opening statement, that being the issue of transparency.
Yes.
I do not wish to encumber these bills with that issue, and you and I have had private conversation on that. And I would just like to see if my understanding is correct, that the chairman is willing to commit that we will have a hearing on the overall issue of pricing transparency so that this may be appropriately presented to the committee without having to do so in the context of each of these individual type bills.
If the gentleman will permit, I do agree that we need more transparency in healthcare pricing. Getting appropriate information to consumers is important, and we want to make sure consumers have information that's timely, comprehensible, and useful in their decision-making. When we address healthcare reform, I think it's an appropriate place for us to look at this kind of information and to have a panel to testify at one of the hearings. And I will work with you as the ranking member, and Mr. Pallone as the chairman of the subcommittee, in fashioning such a panel. If the gentleman would permit, I want to yield to Mr. Pallone.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you said it exactly the way I had suggested it to Mr. Deal, that we definitely need to address this. It's something that's important to me, and we would either have it as part of one of the health care reforms hearing over the next couple months or consider it separately, one or the other.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I would obviously prefer that it be dealt with separately, because I don't want the issue to be ignored by other equally important issues in a single panel. So I would ask you both to consider the possibility of a separate panel addressed to that issue. But with that, I withdraw my objection, and I will not object. I yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate your request, and we'll talk further and see if we can work it out. I was about to ask for a vote on all the bills combined, but Mr. Stupak is here, and he wanted to be recognized, and so I wish to recognize him at this time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for recognizing me. I just want to say a few words on H.R. 1253. The legislation that we have with Mr. Burgess does one simple thing. It requires healthcare companies to be upfront and honest on their policies, when they place limitations, restrictions on benefits prior to the point of sale of their policy. Currently, because of the way the regulations were set up, many Americans were unaware that their health insurance may not cover injuries resulting from certain recreational activities because their policy is unclear or overly broad. This lack of clarity has created a confusing situation for individuals that may ride snowmobiles, horses, ATVs, ORVs, or participate in other recreational activities. While millions of Americans enjoy these activities safely every year, when an individual is injured, they often do not find out that their insurance will not cover their medical expenses until after the injuries. Our bill, H.R. 1253, would require that any limitations and restrictions on benefits be explicit and clear. Insurance companies should be required to make available to participants and beneficiaries in an easily understandable manner a description of the limitations and restrictions included in the policy. By passing this straightforward legislation, we will protect our constituents that may ride motorcycles, horses, snowmobiles, ATVs, or participate in other recreational activities from being caught by surprise when they thought their policy covered any possible injuries that may have resulted. I encourage all my colleagues to once again vote for this legislation as we did last session. I ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter of support from the American Motorcycle Association. I want to thank Chairman Burgess for his work on this legislation, as well as you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Waxman, and Mr. Barton. And I yield back balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stupak. Any further debate on the unblock amendment? Mr. Upton?
I would just like unanimous consent to put in my well-written statement, and to save time, I'll just insert it. It is bipartisan. I thank you for putting it on block. It's the third time. Hopefully, it's the charm for the Senate to act on it.
Thank you very much. Without objection, the gentleman's well-written statement will be substituted for his previous statement that he was going to put in the record, and will be part of the considerations for today. Mr. Burgess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I would also like to submit my coherent and lucidly written statements on both this bill and on 914 for the record, and ask that they be considered.
Without objection, that'll be the order. Any further discussion? If not, the vote comes on the unblock amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to, and all of those bills are duly reported with the usual instructions.